Page 337, Epa 9, 1. Marius had seen the unexpected denouement of the ambuscade upon the track which he had put Javert, but hardly had Javert left the old ruin carrying away his prisoners in 3 coaches when Marius also slipped out of the house. It was only 9 o'clock in the evening. Marius went to Courfeyrac's. Courfeyrac was no longer the imperturbable inhabitant of the Latin Quarter. He had gone to live in the Rue de la Verrerie for political reasons. This quarter was one of those in which the insurrection was fond of installing itself in those days. Marius said to Courfeyrac, "I have come to sleep with you." Courfeyrac drew a mattress from his bed, where there were 2, laid it on the floor, and said, "There you are." The next day, by 7 o'clock in the morning, Marius went back to the tenement, paid his rent, and what was due to Madame Burgon, and had his books, bed, table, bureau, and his 2 chairs loaded upon the handcart, and went off without leaving his address. Javert thought this young man, whose name he had not retained, had been frightened, and had escaped, or perhaps had not even returned home at the time of the ambuscade. Still, he made some effort to find him, but did not succeed. Marius, moreover, was in sore affliction. Everything had relapsed into darkness. He no longer saw anything before him. His life was again plunged into that mystery in which he had been blindly groping. He had for a moment seen close at hand in that obscurity the young girl whom he loved, the old man who seemed her father, these unknown beings who were his only interest and his only hope in this world, and at that moment he had thought to hold them fast. A breath had swept all those shadows away. Page 338. He no longer saw anything before him. His life was again plunged into that mystery in which he had been blindly groping. He had for a moment seen close at hand in that obscurity the young girl whom he loved, the old man who seemed her father, these unknown beings who were his only interest and his only hope in this world, and at that moment he had thought to hold them fast. A breath had swept all those shadows away. Not a spark of certainty or truth escaped even from that most fearful shock. No conjecture was possible. Bitter wretchedness. Marius had a passion in his heart and a night over his eyes. He was pushed, he was drawn, and he could not stir. All had vanished except love. Even of love he had lost the instincts and the sudden illuminations. His whole life was now resumed in 2 words, an absolute uncertainty and an impenetrable mist. To see her again, her. He aspired to this continually. He hoped for it no longer. To crown all, want returned. He felt close upon him, behind him that icy breath, during all these torments, and now for a long time he had discontinued his work, and nothing is more dangerous than discontinued labor. It is a habit lost, a habit easy to abandon and difficult to resume. Man in the dreamy state is naturally prodigal and luxurious. The relaxed mind cannot lead a severe life. There is in this way of living some good mingled with the evil, for if the softening be fatal, the generosity is wholesome and good, but the poor man who is generous and noble, and who does not work, is lost. His resources dry up, his necessities mount up, fatal slope down which the firmest and the noblest are drawn, as well as the weakest and the most vicious, and which leads to one of these 2 pits, suicide or crime. Marius was descending this slope with slow steps, his eyes fixed upon her whom he saw no more. A single sweet idea remained to him, that she had loved him, that her eyes had told him so, that she did not know his name, but that she knew his soul, and that perhaps where she was, whatever that mysterious place might be, she loved him still. Who knows but she was dreaming of him, as he was dreaming of her. Sometimes in the inexplicable hours, such as every heart has, which loves, having reasons for sorrow only, yet feeling nevertheless a vague thrill of joy, he said to himself, "It is her thoughts which come to me." Then he added, "My thoughts reach her also, perhaps." The days passed, however, one after another, and there was nothing new. It seemed to him merely that the dreary space which remained for him to run through was contracting with every instant. He thought that he already saw distinctly the brink and bottomless precipice. "What," he repeated to himself, "shall I never see her again?" If you go to the Rue Saint-Jacques, leave the Barrière at your side, and follow the old interior boulevard to the left for some distance, you will come to the Rue La Sante, then La Glossière, and little before reaching the small stream of the Gobelins, you will find a sort of field, which is in the long and monotonous circuit of the boulevards of Paris. the only spot where Rousseau would be tempted to sit down. That indescribable something from which grace springs is there. A green meadow crossed by the tight-drawn ropes, on which rags are drying in the wind, an old market garden farmhouse built in the time of Louis the XIII, with its large roof grotesquely pierced with dormer windows, broken palisade fences, a small pond between the poplars, women, laughter, voices. And the horizon of the Pantheon, the tree of the deaf mutes, the Val de Grace, black, squat, fantastic, amusing, magnificent, and in the background the severe square summits of the towers of Notre Dame. As a place is worth seeing, nobody goes there, hardly a cart or wagon once in a quarter of an hour. It happened one day that Marius's solitary walks conducted him to this spot near this pond. That day there was rarity on the boulevard, a passer. Marius, vaguely struck with the almost sylvan charm of the spot, asked this traveler, "What is the name of this place?" The traveler answered, "It is the Field of the Lark." And he added, "It was here that Ulbach killed the shepherdess of Ivry." But after that word lark, Marius had heard nothing more. There are such sudden congealations in the dreamy state which a word is sufficient to produce. The whole mind condenses abruptly about one idea, and ceases to be capable of any other perception. "Yes," said he, in a kind of unreasoning stupor peculiar to these mysterious asides, "this is her field. I shall learn here where she lives." This was absurd, but irresistible. He came every day to this Field of the Lark. Page 340. 2. Javert's triumph in the Gorbeau tenement had seemed complete, but it was not so. In the first place, and this was his principal regret, Javert had not made the prisoner. The victim who slips away is more suspicious than the assassin, and it was probable that this personage, so precious and a capture to the bandits, would not be a less valuable prize to the authorities. And then Montparnasse had escaped Javert. He must await another occasion to lay his hand upon that devilish dandy Montparnasse. In fact, having met Éponine, who was standing sentry under the trees of the boulevard, had led her away. Well for him that he did so. He was free. As to Éponine, Javert nabbed her, trifling consolation. Éponine had rejoined Azelma at Les Madeleines. Finally, on the trip from the Gorbeau tenement to La Force, one of the principal prisoners, Clocassu, had been lost. Nobody knew how it was done. The officers and the sergeants didn't understand it. He had changed into vapor. He had got out of the handcuffs. He had slipped through the cracks of the carriage. The fiacre was leaky, and had fled. Nothing could be said, save that on reaching the prison there was no Clocassu. There were neither ferries nor police in the matter. Had Clocassu melted away into the blackness like a snowflake in the winter? Was there some secret convenience of the officers? Did this man belong to the double enigma of disorder and of order? There are such two-edged rascals. However it might be, Clocassu was lost and was not found again. Javert appeared more irritated than astonished at it. As to Marius, that dolt of a lawyer, who was probably frightened and whose name Javert had forgotten, Javert cared little for him. Besides, he was a lawyer. They are always found again. But was he a lawyer merely? The trial commenced. Page 341. 3. Marius now visited nobody, but he sometimes happened to meet Father Mabeuf. While Marius was slowly descending those dismal steps which one might call cellar stairs, and which lead into places without light, where we hear the happy walking above us, Monsieur Mabeuf was descending. The floor of the Cauterets had absolutely no sale more. The experiments upon indigo had not succeeded in the little garden of Austerlitz, which was very much exposed. Monsieur Mabeuf could only cultivate a few rare plants which liked moisture and shade. He was not discouraged, however. He had obtained a bit of ground like the Jardin des Plantes, with a good exposure to carry on at his own cost. His experiments upon indigo, for this he had put the plates of his flora into pawn. He had reduced his breakfast to 2 eggs, and he left one of them for his old servant, whose wages he had not paid for 15 months. And often his breakfast was his only meal. He laughed no more with his childlike laugh. He had become morose, and he now received no visits. Marius was right in not thinking to come. Sometimes at the hour when Monsieur Mabeuf went to the Jardin des Plantes, the old man and this young man met on the Boulevard des Hôpital. They did not speak, but sadly nodded their heads. It is a bitter thing that there should be moment when misery unbinds. They had been two friends. They were two passers. Monsieur Mabeuf now knew only his books, his garden, and his indigo. Those were to him the three forms which happiness, pleasure, and hope had taken. This fed his life. He said to himself, "When I have made my blue balls, I shall be rich. I will take my plates out of pawn. I will bring my flora into vogue through charlatanism, by big payments, and by announcements in the journals. And I will buy. I well know where a copy of Pierre de Madine's Art de Naviguer with woodcuts, edition of 1559. In the meantime he worked all day on his indigo bed. Towards the end of paragraph 2, on page 342. In the meantime he worked all day on his indigo bed, and at night returned home to water his garden and read his books. Monsieur Mabeuf was at this time very nearly 80 years old. One night he saw a singular apparition. He had come home while it was still broad day. Mother Plutarch, whose health was poor, was sick and gone to bed. He had dined on a bone, on which a little meat was left, and a bit of bread, which he had found on the kitchen table, and had sat down on a block of stone, which took the place of a seat in his garden. Monsieur Mabeuf had begun to look through, reading by the way, with the help of his spectacles, two books, which enchanted him, and in which he was even absorbed. A more serious thing at his age. His natural timidity fitted him to a certain extent to accept superstitions. The first of these books was the famous treatise of President Delancre on the inconsistency of demons, and the other was the Quarto of Moutarde de Rubadere on the devils of Varay and the goblins of La Bièvre. This last book interested him in the more since his garden was one of the few spots formerly haunted by goblins. Twilight was beginning to whiten all above and to blacken all below. As he read, Father Mabeuf was looking over the book, which he held in his hand, at his plants, and among others at a magnificent rhododendron, which was one of his consolations. There had been 4 days of drought, wind and sun, without a drop of rain. The stalks bent over, the buds hung down, the leaves were falling. They all needed to be watered. The rhododendron especially was a sad sight. Father Mabeuf was one of those to whom plants have souls. The old man had worked all day on his indigo bed. He was exhausted with his fatigue. He got up, nevertheless, put his books upon the bench, and walked, bent over and with tottering steps, to the well. But when he had grasped the chain, he could not even draw it far enough to unhook it. Then he turned and looked up with an anguished look toward the sky, which was filling with stars. The evening had that serenity which buries the sorrows of man under a strangely dreary yet eternal joy. The night promised to be as dry as the day had been. Stars everywhere, thought the old man, not even the smallest cloud, not a drop of water. And his head, which had been raised for a moment, fell back upon his breast. He raised it again and looked at the sky, murmuring, "A drop of dew, a little pity." He endeavored once more to unhook the well chain, but he could not. At this moment he heard a voice which said, "Father Mabeuf, would you like to have me water your garden?" At the same time he heard a sound like that of a passing deer in the hedge, and he saw, springing out of the shrubbery, a sort of tall, slender girl, who came and stood before him, looking boldly at him. She had less the appearance of a human being than of a form which had just been born of the twilight. Before Father Mabeuf, who was easily startled, and who was, as we have said, subject to fear, could answer a word, this being, whose motions seemed grotesquely abrupt in the obscurity, had unhooked the chain, plunged in and drawn out the bucket, and filled the watering pot. The good man saw this apparition with bare feet and ragged skirt, running along the beds, distributing life about her. The sound of the water upon the leaves filled Father Mabeuf's soul with transport. It seemed to him that now the rhododendron was happy. When the first bucket was emptied, the girl drew a second, then a third. She watered the whole garden, moving thus along the walks, her outline appearing entirely black, shaking her torn shawl over her angular shoulder arms. She seemed something like a bat. When she had ended, Father Mabeuf approached her with tears in his eyes and laid his hand upon her forehead. "God will bless you," said he. "You are an angel, since you care for flowers." "No," she answered, "I am the devil. But that is all the same to me." The old man exclaimed without waiting for, and without hearing her answer, "What a pity that I am so unfortunate and so poor that I cannot do anything for you." "You can do something," said she. "What?" "Tell me where Monsieur Marius lives." The old man did not understand. "What? Monsieur Marius?" He raised his glassy eye and appeared to be looking for something that had vanished. "A young man who used to come here." Meanwhile, Monsieur Mabeuf had fumbled in his memory. "Ah, yes," he exclaimed. "I know who you mean. I know what you mean. Listen now, Monsieur Marius, the Baron Marius Pontemercy. Yes, he lives, or rather he does not live there now. Well, I don't know." While he spoke, he had bent over to tie up a branch of the rhododendron, and he continued, "Ah, I remember now. He passes up the boulevard very often and goes toward La Glacerie, Rue Col de Baubre, the Field of the Lark. Go that way, he isn't hard to find. When Monsieur Mabeuf rose up, there was nobody there. The girl had disappeared. He was decidedly a little frightened. Really, thought he, if my garden was not watered, I should think that it was a spirit. An hour later, when he had gone to bed, this returned to him, and as he was falling asleep at that troubled moment when he thought that, like a fabulous bird which changes itself into fish to pass through the sea, gradually takes up the form of a dream to pass through sleep, he said to himself confusedly, "Indeed, this much resembles what Rube de Rey relates of the goblins. Could it be a goblin?" Page 345. 4. One morning Marius had gone to take a little walk, hoping it would enable him to work on his return. It was entirely so. As soon as he arose in the morning, he sat down before a book and a sheet of paper to work on some translation. He read 4 lines, tried to write one of them, could not, saw a star between his paper and his eyes, and rose from his chair, saying, "I will go out. That will put me in trim." And he would go to the Field of the Lark. That morning he heard behind him and below him, on both banks of the stream, the washerwomen of the Gobelins beating their linen, and over his head the birds chattering and singing in the elms. On the one hand the sound of liberty, of happy unconcern, of winged leisure; on the other the sound of labor, a thing which made him muse profoundly, and almost reflect these two joyous sounds. All at once, in the midst of his ecstasy of exhaustion, he heard a voice which is known to him say, "Ah, there he is." He raised his eyes and recognized the unfortunate child who had come to his room one morning, the elder of the Thénardier girls, Éponine. He now knew her name, singular in fact. She had become more wretched and more beautiful, 2 steps which seemed impossible. She had accomplished a double progress toward the light and toward distress. She was barefooted and in rags, as on the day when she had so resolutely entered his room, only her rags were 2 months older, the holes were larger, the tatters dirtier. It was the same rough voice, the same forehead tanned and wrinkled by exposure, the same free, wild, and wandering gaze. She had, in addition to her former expression, that mixture of fear and sorrow which experience of prison adds to misery. And with all this, she was beautiful. What a star thou art, O youth! Meantime, she stopped before Marius with an expression of pleasure upon her livid face, and something which resembled a smile. She stood for a few seconds as if she could not speak. "I have found you, then," she said at last. "Father Mabeuf was right. It was on this boulevard. How I have looked for you! If you only knew. Do you know, I have been in the jug a fortnight. They have let me out, seeing that there was nothing against me, and then I was not the age of discernment. It lacked 2 months. Oh, how I have looked for you! It is 6 weeks now. You don't live down there any longer?" "No," said Marius. "Where do you live now?" Marius did not answer. "Ah," she continued, "you have a hole in your shirt. I must mend it for you." She resumed with an expression which gradually grew darker. "You don't seem glad to see me." Marius said nothing. She herself was silent for a moment, but then exclaimed, "But if I would, I could easily make you glad." "How?" inquired Marius. "What does that mean?" "Ah, you used to speak more kindly to me," replied she. "Well, what is it that you mean?" She bit her lip. She seemed to hesitate, as if passing through a kind of interior struggle. At last she appeared to decide upon her course. "So much the worse, it makes no difference. You look sad. I want you to be glad. But promise me that you will laugh. I want to see you laugh and hear you say, 'Ah, well, that is good.' Poor Monsieur Marius, you know, you promised me that you would give me whatever I should ask." "Yes, but tell me." She looked into Marius's eyes and said, "I have the address." Marius turned pale. All his blood flowed back to his heart. "What address?" "The address you asked me for." She added, as if she were making an effort, "The address? You know well enough." "Yes," stammered Marius. "Of the young lady?" Having pronounced this word, she sighed deeply. Marius sprang from the bank on which he was sitting, and took her wildly by the hand. "Oh, come, show me the way, tell me, ask me for whatever you will. Where is it?" "Come with me," she answered. "I am not sure of the street and the number. It is away on the other side from here, but I know the house very well. I will show you." She withdrew her hand and added in a tone which would have pierced the heart of an observer, but which did not even touch the intoxicated and transported Marius, "Oh, how glad you are! Show me the way, right away." "Come, oh, how glad he is," said she. After a few steps she stopped. "By the way, you know you have promised me something." Marius fumbled in his pocket. He had nothing in the world but 5 francs. He took it and put it into Éponine's hand. She opened her fingers and let the piece fall on the ground, and looking at him with a gloomy look, "I don't want your money," said she. Page 348. In the house of the Rue Plumet. Toward the middle of the last century, a velvet-capped president of the Parlement of Paris, being a mistress and concealing it, for in those days the great lords exhibited their mistresses and their begoys, concealed theirs, had une petite maison built in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, in the deserted Rue des Bloumins, which is now called the Rue Plumet, not far from the spot which was then by the name of Combat et Saint-Mament. This is the summer house of but 2 stories, 2 rooms on the ground floor, 2 chambers in the second story, a kitchen below, a boudoir above, a garret next to the roof, the whole fronted by a garden with a large iron-grated gate opening on the street. This garden contained about an acre. This was all that the passers-by could see. But in the rear of the house there was a small yard, at the further end of which there was a low building, 2 rooms only, and a cellar. A convenience intended to conceal a child and nurse in case of need. This building communicated from the rear by a masked door, opening secretly along a narrow passage paved winding open to the sky, bordered by the 2 walls, and which concealed with a wonderful art, and as it were lost between the enclosures of the gardens and fields, all the corners and turnings of which it is followed, came to an end at another door, also concealed, which opened a third of a mile away, almost in another quarter, upon the unbuilt end of the Rue de Babylone. This house and this passage, which have since disappeared, were still in existence 15 years ago. The house remained furnished with its old furniture, and always for sale or to let. And the 10 or 12 persons who passed through the Rue Plumet in the course of the year were notified of this by a yellow and illegible piece of paper which had hung upon the railing of the garden since 1810. Toward the end of the Restoration, these same passers might have noticed that the paper had disappeared, and that also the shutters of the upper story were open. The house was indeed occupied. The windows had little curtains, a sign that there was a woman there. In the month of October 1829, a man of a certain age had appeared and hired the house as it stood, including, of course, the building in the rear, and the passage which ran out to the Rue de Babylone. He had secret openings of the 2 doors of this passage repaired. The new tenant had ordered a few repairs, and finally came and installed himself with a young girl and an aged servant, without any noise, rather like somebody stealing in than like a man who enters his own house. The neighbors did not gossip about it, for the reason that there were no neighbors. This tenant, no partial extent, was Jean Valjean. The young girl was Cosette. The servant was a spinster named Toussaint, whom Jean Valjean had saved from the hospital and misery, and who was old, stuttering, and a native of Provence, 3 qualities which had determined Jean Valjean to take her with him. He hired the house under the name of Monsieur Fauchelevent. Gentlemen, in which has been related hitherto, the reader doubtless recognized Jean Valjean even before Thénardier did. Why had Jean Valjean left the convent of the Petit Picpus? What had happened? Nothing had happened. As we remember, Jean Valjean was happy in the convent, so happy that his conscience at last began to be troubled. He saw Cosette every day. He felt paternity springing up and developing him more and more. He brooded this child with his soul, and he said to himself that she was his, that nothing could take her from him, that this would be so indefinitely, that certainly she would become a nun, being every day gently led on toward it. In reflecting upon this, he at last began to find difficulties. He questioned himself. He asked himself if all this happiness were really his own, if it were not made up of the happiness of another, of the happiness of this child, whom he was appropriating and plundering. He, an old man, if this was not robbery, he said to himself that this child had a right to know what life was before renouncing it, that to cut her off in advance and in some sort without consulting her from all pleasure, under pretense of saving her from all trial, to take advantage of her ignorance and isolation, to give her an artificial vocation, was to outrage a human creature, and to lie to God. And who knows but, thinking over all of this some day, and being a nun with regret, Cosette might come to hate him, a final thought which was almost selfish and less heroic than the others, but which was insupportable to him. He resolved to leave the convent. His determination once formed, he awaited an opportunity. It was not slow to present itself. Old Fauchelevent died. Jean Valjean asked an audience of the reverend prioress, and told her that, having received a small inheritance on the death of his brother, which enabled him to live henceforth without labor, he would leave the service of the convent and take away his daughter, but that as it was not just that Cosette, not taking her vows, should have been educated gratuitously, he humbly begged the reverend prioress to allow him to offer the community as indemnity for the 5 years which Cosette had passed there, the sum of 5,000 francs. On leaving the convent, he took in his own hands, and would not entrust to any assistant, the little box, the key of which he always had about him. This box puzzled Cosette, on account of the odor embalming him which came from it. Let us just say at once that henceforth this box never left him more. He always had it in his room. It was the first and sometimes the only thing that he carried away in his changes of abode. Cosette laughed about it and called the box the inseparable, saying, "I am jealous of it." Jean Valjean nevertheless did not appear again in the open city without deep anxiety. He discovered the house in the Rue Blomet, and buried himself in it. He was henceforth in possession of the name of Ultimus Fauchelevent. At the same time, he hired 2 other lodgings in Paris, very humble and of a poor appearance, in 2 quarters widely distant from each other, one in the Rue de l'Ouest, and the other in the Rue de l'Homme. He went from time to time, now to the Rue Homme Armé, and now to the Rue de l'Ouest, to spend a month or 6 weeks with Cosette without taking Toussaint. He was waited upon by porters, and gave himself out for a man of some means, of the suburbs, having a foothold in the city. This lofty virtue had 3 domiciles in Paris in order to escape from the police. Still, properly speaking, he lived in the Rue Plumet, and he had ordered his life there in the following manner. Cosette with the servant occupied the house. She had the large bedroom with painted piers, the boudoir with gilded mouldings, the president's parlor furnished with tapestry, and the huge armchairs. She had the garden. All winter, Cosette's petite maison was warmed from the top to bottom. For his part, he lived in a sort of porter's lodge in the backyard, with a mattress on a cot bedstead. A white wood table, 2 straw chairs, an earthen water pitcher, a few books upon a board, his dear box in the corner, never any fire. He dined with Cosette, and there was a black loaf on the table for him. Cosette had trained to housekeeping in the convent, and she regulated the expenses, which were very moderate. Every day Jean Valjean took Cosette's arm and went to walk with her. They went to the least frequented walk of the Luxembourg, and every Sunday to Mass, always at Saint-Jacques du Haut-Pas, because it was quite distant. As that is a very poor quarter, he gave much alms there, and the unfortunate surrounded him in the church. He was fond of taking Cosette to visit the needy and the sick. No stranger came into the house in the Rue Plumet. Toussaint bought the provisions, and Jean Valjean himself went after the water to a watering trough, which was nearby on the boulevard. Monsieur Fauchelevent belonged to the National Guard. He had not been able to escape the close meshes of the enrollment of 1831. The municipal investigation made at that time had extended even to the convent of the Petit Picpus, the sort of impenetrable and holy cloud from which Jean Valjean had come forth venerable in the eyes of his magistracy, and in consequence worthy of mounting guard. 3 or 4 times a year Jean Valjean donned his uniform and performed his duties very willingly. Moreover, it was a good disguise for him, which associated him with everybody else while leaving him solitary. To resemble the crowd who pays their taxes, this was his whole ambition. This man had for his ideal within the angel without the bourgeois. Neither Jean Valjean, nor Cosette, nor Toussaint ever came in or went out except by the gate on the Rue des Babylons. Unless one had seen them through the grated gate of the garden, it would have been very difficult to guess that they lived in the Rue Le Plumet. This gate always remained closed. Jean Valjean had the garden uncultivated, that it might not attract attention. Page 353. 2. Cosette had left the convent still almost a child. She was a little more than 14 years old, and she was at the ungrateful age. As we have said, apart from her eyes, she seemed rather homely than pretty. She had, however, no ungraceful features, but she was awkward, thin, timid, and bold at the same time. A big child, in short. Nothing prepares a young girl for passions like the convent. The convent turns the thoughts in the direction of the unknown. The heart, thrown back upon itself, makes for itself a channel, being unable to overflow, and deepens, being unable to expand. On leaving the convent, Cosette could have found nothing more grateful and more dangerous than the house on the Rue Plumet. It was a continuation of solitude from the beginning of liberty, an enclosed garden, but a sharp, rich, voluptuous, and odorous nature. The same dreams as in the convent, but with glimpses of young men, a grating, but upon the street. Still, we repeat, when she came there she was but a child. She loved her father, that is to say, Jean Valjean, with all her heart, with a frank filial passion which made the good man a welcome and very pleasant companion for her. This simple man was sufficient for Cosette's thoughts, even as this wild garden was to her eyes. When she had a good chase after the butterflies, she would come up to him breathless and say, "Oh, how I have run!" He would kiss her forehead. Cosette had but vague remembrance of her childhood. She prayed morning and evening for her mother, whom she had never known. The Thénardiers had remained to her like 2 hideous faces from some dream. She remembered that she had been one at night sent into a wood after water. She thought that after that she was very, very far away from Paris. It seemed to her that she had commenced life in abyss, and that Jean Valjean had drawn her out of it. Her childhood impressed her as a time when there were only centipedes, spiders, and snakes about her, when she was dozing at night before going to sleep. As she had no clear idea of being Jean Valjean's daughter, and that he was her father, she imagined that her mother's soul had passed into this good man, and come to live with her. While Cosette was a little girl, Jean Valjean had been fond of talking with her about her mother. When she was a young maiden, this was impossible for him. It seemed to him that he no longer dared. Was this on account of Cosette? Was it on account of Fantine? He took a sort of religious horror at introducing that shade into Cosette's thoughts, and at bringing in the dead as a third sharer of their destiny. The more sacred that shade was to him, the more formidable it seemed to him. He thought of Fantine and felt overwhelmed with silence. He saw dimly in the darkness something which resembled a finger on the mouth. Had all that modesty which had once been Fantine's, and which during her life had been forced out of her by violence, returned after her death to take its place over her, to watch, indignant, over the peace of the dead woman, and to guard her fiercely in a tomb? Did Jean Valjean, without knowing it, feel its influence? We who believe in death are not of those who would reject this mysterious explanation. Hence the impossibility of pronouncing, even at Cosette's desire, this name Fantine. One day Cosette said to him, "Father, I saw my mother in a dream last night. She had 2 great wings. My mother must have attained to sanctity in her life." "Through martyrdom," answered Jean Valjean. Still, Jean Valjean was happy. When Cosette went out with him, she leaned upon his arm, proud, happy in the fullness of her heart. Jean Valjean, at all these marks of a tenderness, so exclusive and so fully satisfied with him, felt his thought melt into delight. The poor man shuddered, overflowed with an angelic joy. He declared in his transport that this would last through life. He said to himself that he really had not suffered enough to deserve such radiant happiness, and he thanked God in the depths of his soul for having permitted that he, a miserable man, should be so loved by this innocent being. Page 355. 3. One day Cosette happened to look in the mirror, and she said to herself, "What?" It seemed to her almost that she was pretty. This threw her into a strange anxiety. Up to this moment she had never thought of her face. She had seen herself in her glass, but she had not looked at herself, and then she had been told that she was homely. Jean Valjean alone would quietly say, "Why no? Why no?" However that might be, Cosette had always thought herself homely. She had grown up in that idea of the pliant resignation of childhood, and now suddenly her mirror said like Jean Valjean, "Why no?" She had no sleep that night. If I were pretty, thought she, how funny it would be if I should be pretty. And she called to mind those of her companions whose beauty had made an impression on the convent, and said, "What? I should be like Mademoiselle such a one." She was in the garden one day, and heard the poor old Toussaint saying, "Monsieur, do you notice how pretty Mademoiselle is growing?" Cosette did not hear what her father answered. Toussaint's words threw her into a sort of commotion. She ran out of the garden, went up to her room, hurried to the glass. It was 3 months since she had looked at herself, and uttered a cry. She was dazzled by herself. She was beautiful and handsome. She could not help being of Toussaint's and her mirror's opinion. Her form was complete, her skin had become white, her hair had grown lustrous. An unknown splendor was lighted up in her blue eyes. The consciousness of her beauty came to her entire, in a moment, like a broad daylight when it bursts upon us. She went down into the garden again, thinking herself a queen, hearing the birds sing. It was in winter, seeing the sky golden, the sunshine in the trees, flowers among the shrubbery, wild, mad, and in inexpressible rapture. For his part, Jean Valjean felt a deep and undefinable anguish in his heart. He had, in fact, for some time past, been contemplating with terror that beauty which appeared every day more radiant upon Cosette's sweet face, a dawn charming to all others, dreary to himself. He said to himself, "How beautiful she is! What will become of me?" From the morrow of the day on which she had said, "Really, I am handsome," Cosette gave attention to her dress. In less than a month little Cosette was, in that thebaid of the Rue des Babylons, not only one of the prettiest women, which is something, but one of the best dressed in Paris, which is much more. The first day that Cosette went out with her dress and mantle of black damask, and her white crêpe hat, she came to take Jean Valjean's arm, gay, radiant, rosy, proud, and brilliant. "Father," said she, "how do you like this?" Jean Valjean answered in a voice which resembled the bitter voice of envy, "Charming." From that day he noticed that Cosette, who previously was always asking to stay in, saying, "Father, I enjoy myself better here with you," was now always asking to go out. Indeed, what is the use of having a pretty face and a delightful dress if you do not show them? Cosette, by learning that she was beautiful, lost the grace of not knowing it. An exquisite grace for beauty heightened by artlessness is ineffable, and nothing is so adorable as dazzling innocence going on her way and holding in her hand all unconsciousness, the key of a paradise. But what she lost in ingenuous grace, she gained in pensive and serious charm. Her whole person, pervaded by the joys of youth, innocence, and beauty, breathed a splendid melancholy. It was at this period that Marius, after the lapse of 6 months, saw her again at the Luxembourg. Page 357. 4. Cosette in her seclusion, like Marius in his, was all ready to take fire. Destiny, with its mysterious and fatal patience, was slowly bringing these two beings near each other, fully charged and all languishing with the stormy electricities of passion. These two souls, which held love as two clouds hold lightning, and which were to meet and mingle in a glance like clouds in a flash. The power of a glance has been so much abused in love stories that it has become to be disbelieved in. Few people dare now to say that two beings have fallen in love because they have looked at each other. Yet it is in this way that love begins, and in this way only. The rest is only the rest, and comes afterward. Nothing is more real than these great shocks which two souls give each other in exchanging this spark. At that particular moment when Cosette unconsciously looked up with this glance which so affected Marius, Marius had no suspicion that he also had the glance which affected Cosette. She received from him the same harm and the same blessing. We remember Marius's hesitations, his palpitations, his terrors. He remained at his seat and did not approach, which vexed Cosette. One day she said to Jean Valjean, "Father, let us walk a little this way." Seeing that Marius was not coming to her, she went to him. That day Cosette's glance made Marius mad. Marius' glance made Cosette tremble. Marius went away confident and Cosette anxious. From that day onward, they adored each other. The first thing that Cosette felt was a vague yet deep sadness. It seemed to her that since yesterday her soul had become black. She no longer recognized herself. The whiteness of soul of young girls, which is composed of coldness and gaiety, is like snow. It melts before love, which is its sun. It proved that the love which presented itself was precisely that which best suited the condition of her soul. It was a sort of far-off worship, a mute contemplation, a deification by an unknown votary. It was the apprehension of adolescence. By adolescence, the dream of which her nights had become a romance, and remaining a dream, the wished-for phantom realized at last and made flesh, but still having neither a name, nor wrong, nor stain, nor need, nor defect in a word, a lover distant and dwelling in the ideal, a chimera having a form. Any closer and more palpable encounter would at this first period have terrified Cosette, still half buried in the magnifying mirage of the cloister. She had all the terrors of children and all the terrors of nuns commingled. The spirit of the convent with which she had been imbued for 5 years was still slowly evaporating from her whole person, and made everything tremulous about her. In this condition it was not a lover that she needed. It was not even an admirer. It was a vision. She began to adore Marius as something charming, luminous, and impossible. As extreme artlessness meets extreme coquetry, she smiled upon him very frankly. Marius and Cosette were in the dark in regard to each other. They did not speak, they did not bow, they were not acquainted, they saw each other, and like the stars in the sky, separated by millions of leagues, they lived by gazing upon each other. Thus it was that Cosette gradually became a woman, and beautiful and loving, grew with consciousness of her beauty, and an ignorance of her love, coquettish withal, through innocence. 359. 5. Every condition has its instinct. The old and eternal mother, nature, silently warned Jean Valjean of the presence of Marius. Jean Valjean shuddered in the darkest of his mind. Jean Valjean saw nothing, knew nothing, but still gazed with persistent fixedness at the darkness which surrounded him, as if he perceived on one side something which was building, and on the other something which was falling down. Marius also warned, and according to the deep law of God, by the same mother nature, did all that he could to hide himself from the Father. It happened, however, that Jean Valjean sometimes perceived him. Marius's ways were no longer at all natural. He had an equivocal prudence and an awkward boldness. Jean Valjean cordially detested this young man. He had never opened his mouth to Cosette about the unknown man. One day, however, he could not contain himself, and with that uncertain despair which hastily drops the plummet into its unhappiness, said to her, What a pedantic air that young man has." Cosette, a year before, an unconcerned little girl, would have answered, "Why, no, he is charming." 10 years later, with the love of Marius in her heart, she would have answered, "Pedantic and insupportable to the sight." You are quite right. At the period of life and of heart which she then was, she merely answered with a supreme calmness, "That young man?" as if she saw him for the first time in her life. How stupid I am, thought Jean Valjean. She had not even noticed him. I have shown him to her myself. O simplicity of the old, depth of the young. There was nevertheless a painful tremor in the heart. The moment when Cosette would fall in love might come at any instant. Does not everything begin by indifference? Jean Valjean had not discontinued the promenades in the Luxembourg, not wishing to do anything singular, and above all dreading to excite any suspicion in Cosette. But during those hours so sweet to the two lovers, while Cosette was sending her smile to the intoxicated Marius, who perceived nothing but that which, and now saw nothing in the world save one radiant, adored face, Jean Valjean fixed upon Marius glaring and terrible eyes. He who had come to believe that he was no longer capable of a malevolent feeling, had moments in which, when Marius was there, he thought that he was again becoming a savage and ferocious, and felt opening and upheaving against this young man. Those old depths of his soul where there had been so much wrath, it seemed to him almost as if the unknown craters were forming within him again. We know the rest. The insanity of Marius continued. One day he followed Cosette to the Rue de l'Ouest. A week after Jean Valjean had moved, he resolved that he would never set his foot again either in the Luxembourg or the Rue de l'Ouest. He returned to the Rue Le Plumet. Cosette did not complain. She said nothing. She asked no questions. She did not seek to know any reason. She was already at that point at which one fears discovery and self-betrayal. Jean Valjean had no experience of this misery, the only misery which is charming, and the only misery which he did not know. For this reason he did not understand the deep significance of Cosette's silence. He noticed only that she had become sad, and he became gloomy. Sometimes he asked her, "What is the matter with you?" She answered, "Nothing." And after a silence, as he felt that he was sad also, she continued, "And you, father, is not something the matter with you?" "Me? Nothing," said he. These two beings who had loved each other so exclusively, and so touching a love, and who had lived so long for each other, were now suffering by each other and through each other without speaking of it, without harsh feeling, and smiling all the while. Page 361. The end of which is unlike the beginning. 1. Cosette's grief, so poignant still and so acute 4 or 5 months before, had without her knowledge even entered upon convalescence. Nature, spring, her youth, her love for her father, the gaiety of the birds and the flowers were filtering little by little, day by day, drop by drop into the soul. So pure and so young, something which almost resembled oblivion. Was the fire dying out entirely, or was it merely becoming a bed of embers? The truth is that she had scarcely anything left of that sorrowful and consuming feeling. One day she suddenly thought of Marius. "What?" said she. "I do not think of him now." This was this very time when Marius was descending gloomily toward agony and saying, "If I could only see her again before I die." Whose fault was it? Nobody's. Marius was of that temperament which sinks into grief and remains there. Cosette was that of which plunges in and comes out again. A singular incident followed. In the garden near the grated grate on the street, there was a stone seat protected from the gaze of the curious by a hedge, but which nevertheless by an effort the arm of a passer could reach through the grating and the hedge. One evening in this same month of April, Jean Valjean had gone out. Cosette, after sunset, had sat down on this seat. The wind was freshening in the trees. Cosette was musing. A vague sadness was coming over her little by little. That vague sadness was coming over her little by little. That invincible sadness which evening gives, and which comes perhaps, who knows, from the mystery of the tomb, half opened at that hour. Fantine was perhaps in that shadow. Cosette rose, slowly made the round of that garden, walking in the grass which was wet with dew, and saying to herself through the kind of melancholy somnambulism which she was enveloped, "One really needs wooden shoes for the garden at this hour. I shall catch a cold." She returned to the seat. Just as she was sitting down, she noticed in the place that she had left a stone of considerable size, which evidently was not there the moment before. Cosette reflected upon this stone, asking herself what it meant. Suddenly the idea that this stone did not come upon the seat of itself, that somebody had put it there, that an arm had passed through that grating, this idea came to her and made her afraid. There was the stone, no doubt. Was it possible? She did not touch it, fled without daring to look behind her, took refuge in the house, and immediately shut the glass door of the stairs with shutter, bar, and bolt. She asked Toussaint, "Has my father come in?" "Not yet, mademoiselle." Cosette had all the doors and windows carefully closed, made Toussaint go over the whole house from cellar to garret, shut herself in her room, drew her bolts, looked under her bed, lay down, and slept badly. All night she saw the stone, big as a mountain and full of caves. At sunrise, the peculiarity of sunrise is to make us laugh at all our terrors of the night, and our laugh is always proportioned to the fear we have had at sunrise. Cosette, on waking, looked upon her fright as upon a nightmare, and said to herself, "What have I been dreaming about?" The sun, which shone through the cracks of her shutters, and made the damask curtains purple, reassured her to such an extent that it all vanished from her thoughts, even the stone. She dressed herself and went down to the garden, ran to the bench, and felt a cold sweat. The stone was there. But this was only for a moment. What is fright by night is curiosity by day. "Pshaw," said she, "now let us see." She raised the stone, which was pretty large. There was something underneath which resembled a letter. It was a white paper envelope. Cosette seized it. There was no address on the one side, no wafer on the other. Still the envelope, although open, was not empty. Papers could be seen in it. Cosette examined it. There was no more fright. There was curiosity no more. There was a beginning of anxious interest. Cosette took out of the envelope what it contained, a quire of paper, each page of which was numbered and contained a few lines written in a rather pretty handwriting, thought Cosette, and very fine. Cosette looked for a name. There was none. A signature. There was none. To whom it was addressed? To her, probably, since a hand had placed the packet upon her seat. From whom did it come? An irresistible fascination took possession of her. She endeavored to turn her eyes away from the street, the acacias all steeped in light, some pigeons which were flying about a neighboring roof. Then all at once her eye eagerly sought the manuscript, and she said to herself that she must know what there was in it. This is what she read. Page 364. 2. The reduction of the universe is to a single being, the expansion of a single being even to God. This is love. God is behind all things, but all things hide God. Things are black, creatures are opaque. To love a being is to render her transparent. Love partakes of the soul itself. It is of the same nature. Like it, it is a divine spark. Like it, it is incorruptible, indivisible, imperishable. It is a moment of fire which is within us, which is immortal and infinite, which nothing can limit and which nothing can extinguish. We feel it burn, even in the marrow of our bones, and we see it radiate even to the depths of the sky. O love, adorations, light of two minds which comprehend each other, of two hearts which are interchanged, of two glances which interpenetrate. You will come to me, will you not, happiness? Walks together in the solitudes, days blessed and radiant. I have sometimes dreamed that from time to time hours detached themselves from the life of angels, and came here below to pass through the destiny of men. God can add nothing to the happiness of those who love one another, but to give them unending duration. After a life of love, an eternity of love is an augmentation indeed, but to increase in its intensity the ineffable felicity which love gives to the soul in this world is impossible, even with God. God is the plenitude of heaven. Love is the plenitude of man. You look at a star from two motives, because it is luminous and because it is impenetrable. You have at your side a softer radiance and a greater mystery. Woman. If you are stone, be lodestone. If you are a plant, be sensitive. If you are a man, be love. Does she still come to the Luxembourg? No, monsieur. She hears Mass in this church, does she not? She comes here no more. Does she still live in this house? She has moved away. Whither has she gone to live? She did not stay. What a gloomy thing not to know the address of one's soul. You who suffer because you love, love still more. To die of love is to live by it. What a grand thing to be loved. What a grander thing still to love. The heart becomes heroic through passion. It is no longer composed of anything but what is pure. It no longer rests upon anything but what is elevated and great. An unworthy thought can no more spring up in it than a nettle upon a glacier. The soul, lofty and serene, inaccessible to common passions and common emotions, rising above the clouds and the shadows of this world, its follies, its falsehoods, its hates, its vanities, its miseries, inhabits the blue of the skies, and only feels more the deep and the subterranean commotions of destiny, as the summit of the mountains feels the quaking of the earth. Were there not someone who loved, the sun would be extinguished. Page 365. 3. During the reading, Cosette entered gradually into the reverie. This manuscript, in which she found still more clearness and obscurity, had the effect upon her of half-opened sanctuary. Each of these mysterious lines was resplendent to her eyes, and flooded her heart with a strange light. The education which she had received had always spoken to her of the soul, and never of love, almost like one who should speak of the brand and not of the flame. This manuscript revealed to her suddenly and sweetly the whole of love, the sorrow, the destiny, the life, the eternity, the beginning, the end. It was like a hand which had opened and thrown suddenly upon her a handful of sunbeams. She felt in these few lines a passionate, ardent, generous, honest nature, a consecrated will, an immense sorrow, and a boundless hope, an oppressed heart, a glad ecstasy. Now these pages, from whom could they come? Who could have written them? Cosette did not hesitate for a moment. One single man. He. Day had revived in her mind. All had happened again. She felt a wonderful joy and a deep anguish. It was he who wrote to her. He who was there. He whose arm had passed through that grating. While she was forgetting him, he had found her again. But had she forgotten him? No, never. She was mad to have thought so for a moment. She had always loved him, always adored him. The fire had been covered and had smoldered for a time, but she clearly saw it had only sunk in the deeper. And now it burst out anew and fired her whole being. This letter was like a spark dropped from that other soul into hers. She felt the conflagration rekindling. She was penetrated by every word of the manuscript. "Oh, yes," said she, "how I recognize all this. This is what I had already read in his eyes." She went back to the house and shut herself up in her room to read over the manuscript again, to learn it by heart and to muse. When she had read it well, she kissed it and put it to her bosom. It was done. Cosette had fallen back into the profound seraphic love. The abyss of Eden had reopened. All that day Cosette was in a sort of stupefaction. She could hardly think. Her ideas were like a tangled skein in her brain. She could really conjecture nothing. She hoped while yet trembling. What? Vague things. She dared to promise herself nothing, and she would refuse herself nothing. Pallors passed over her face and chills over her body. It seemed to her at moments that she was entering the chimerical. She said to herself, "Is it real?" Then she felt the beloved paper under her dress and pressed it against her heart. She felt its corners upon her flesh, and if Jean Valjean had seen her at that moment, he would have shuddered before that luminous and unknown joy which flashed from her eyes. "Oh, yes," thought she, "it is indeed he. This comes from him, for me." And she said to herself that an intervention of angels, that a celestial chance had restored him to her. Page 367. 4. When evening came, Jean Valjean went out. Cosette dressed herself. She arranged her hair in the manner which best became her, and she put on a dress, the neck of which, as it had received one cut of the scissors too much, and as by this slope it allowed the turn of the neck to be seen, was, as the young girls say, a little immodest. It was not the least in the world immodest, but it was prettier than otherwise. She did all this without knowing why. Did she intend to go out? No. Did she expect a visit? No. At dusk she went down to the garden. Toussaint was busy in her kitchen, which looked out upon the backyard. She began to walk under the branches, putting them aside with her hand from time to time, because there were some that were very low. She thus reached the seat. The stone was still there. She sat down and laid her soft white hand upon that stone, as if she would caress it and thank it. All at once she had that indefinable impression which we feel though we see nothing, when there is somebody standing behind us. She turned her head and arose. It was he. He was bareheaded. He appeared pale and thin. She hardly discerned his black dress. The twilight dimmed his fine forehead and covered his eyes with darkness. He had under a veil of incomparable sweetness something of death and of night. His face was lighted by the light of a dying day, and by the thought of a departing soul. It seemed as if he was not yet a phantom, and was now no longer a man. His hat was lying a few steps distant in the shrubbery. Cosette, ready to faint, did not utter a cry. She drew back, slowly, for she felt herself attracted forward. He did not stir. Through the sad and ineffable something which enwrapped him, she felt the look of his eyes, which she did not see. Cosette, in retreating, encountered a tree and leaned against it, but for this tree she would have fallen. Then she heard his voice, that voice which she had never heard, really heard, hardly rising above the rustling of the leaves, and murmuring, "Pardon me, I am here. My heart is bursting. I could not live as I was. I have come. Have you read what I placed there on this seat? Do you recognize me at all? Do not be afraid of me. It is a long time now. Do you remember the day when you looked upon me? It was at the Luxembourg, near the Gladiator. And the day when you passed before me, it was the 16th of June and the 2nd of July. It will soon be a year. For a very long time now, I have not seen you at all. At night I came here. Do not be afraid. Nobody sees me. I come for a near look at your windows. I walk very softly that you may not hear, for perhaps you would be afraid. Once I heard you sing. I was happy. Does it disturb you that I should hear you sing through the shutter? It can do you no harm. It cannot, can it? See, you are my angel. Let me come sometimes. I believe I am going to die. If you but knew. I adore you. Pardon me, I am talking to you. I do not know what I am saying to you. Perhaps I annoy you. Do I annoy you? "Oh, mother," said she, and she sank down upon herself as if she were dying. He caught her. She fell. He caught her in his arms. He grasped her tightly, unconscious of what he was doing. He supported her even while tottering himself. He felt as if his head were enveloped in smoke. Flashes of light passed through his eyelids. His ideas vanished. It seemed to him that he was performing a religious act, and that he was committing a profanation. Moreover, he did not feel one passionate emotion for this ravishing woman, whose form he felt against his heart. He was lost in love. She took his hand and laid it on her heart. He felt the paper there and stammered, "You love me, then?" She answered in a voice so low that it was more than a breath, which could scarcely be heard, "Hush, you know it." And she hid her blushing head in the bosom of the proud and intoxicated young man. He fell upon the seat, and she by his side. There were no more words. The stars were beginning to shine. How was it that their lips met? How is it that the birds sing, that the snow melts, that the rose opens, that May blooms, that the dawn winds behind the black trees on the shivering summit of the hills? One kiss, and that was all. Both trembled, and they looked at each other in the darkness with brilliant eyes. They felt neither the fresh night, nor the cold stone, nor the damp ground, nor the wet grass. They looked at each other, and their hearts were full of thought. They had clasped hands without knowing it. She did not ask him. She did not even think of it, in what way and by what means he had succeeded in penetrating into the garden. It seemed so natural to her that he should be there. From time to time, Marius's knee touched Cosette's knee, which gave them both a thrill. At intervals, Cosette faltered out a word. Her soul trembled upon her lips like a drop of dew upon a flower. Gradually they began to talk. Overflow succeeded to silence, which is fullness. The night was serene and splendid. Above their heads these two beings, pure as spirits, told each other all their dreams, their frenzies, their ecstasies, their chimeras, their despondencies. How they had adored each other from afar. How they had longed for each other. Their despair when they had ceased to see each other. They confided to each other in an intimacy of the ideal, which even now nothing could have increased. All that was most hidden and most mysterious of themselves, these two hearts poured themselves out into each other, so that at the end of an hour it was the young man who had the young girl's soul, and the young girl who had the soul of the young man. They interpenetrated, they enchanted, they dazzled each other. When they had finished, when they had told each other everything, she laid her head upon his shoulder and asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Marius," said he. "And yours?" "My name is Cosette."